what I wanted to talk to you about is connected urbanism, but connected in a new kind of sense. I've been working with a group at QUT on smart cities and how technology, the physical and the digital, are colliding in urban environments, in the built environment. But usually the term connected is used to talk about the technology and the sensors and the IoT, and we're talking about connectivity in that sense. Now, I think what is interesting is to actually talk about the way we're also connected to other dimensions in terms of the ecosystem, and some of this came already to the fore in the previous talk. So what I wanted to illustrate is this notion of cohabitation, and while we can maybe reframe the smart city agenda and our urban planning kind of theories about the way that we think of population growth and rethink that in a way that we are actually engaged in a cohabitation approach rather than one that is just driven by growth paradigms. To give you a bit of background on the work that we do, we are usually kind of associated with the smart city agenda, but we also try to be quite critical about it. So we have that knowledge of people from computer science, from engineering, from planning, but also from anthropology, from the other humanities and social sciences, even from the arts, because we are hosted by the creative industries faculty. And we've been doing this for a while now. So usually these kinds of images are coming up when you think of the smart city agenda. There is big data, there is control centers, there is automation, there is the notion towards efficiency gains. And a lot of that can be quite useful in so many different scenarios. But what I'm posing here is really that for the next 100 years, there might be other challenges that we've got to consider as well, beyond just productivity and efficiency gains. And so when we always have a notion of a very technocratic, a very technology-led approach to the way that we look at problems, then this is maybe what comes up. There's traffic congestion, well, we can maybe build on top of it, or we build another road. Although there's a lot of evidence already suggesting that if you build more roads, they will be just taken up by more cars. This is the team. It's been really a pleasure to have this diversity of people surrounding me at QUT. We've had our 10-year celebration in 2016, and what we are trying to do is work at that intersection of people, place, and technology. So as I said, we have these different influences coming together, but what we've also been doing over the last 10 or 12 years now is push towards this human-centered approach, and it's actually now this moment, and especially looking at some of the research that, for instance, Donna has been doing, but also others, that we are questioning that. We're actually now actively questioning the human-centeredness, and I'll get back to that point in a second. Some of the examples of having a very human-centered approach, there's obviously a lot of merit in that, are illustrated with some of these pictures. For instance, we're very keen on tactical urbanism, such as Parking Day. This is a picture on the 16th of September in Salzburg, in Austria, actually. Martin will be pleased for me to bring up an Austrian example. You can see the cars on the left side, and then people are starting to feed the parking meters to actually be able to lease the public space back from the city, but for another purpose than parking their car, by placing AstroTurf and deck chairs and turning it into a bit of a street fest for 24 hours. So you can see there on Saturday at 1:30 that the street looks very different. This one is an example of yarn bombing, which is another example of reclaiming the street and making it a bit more humane and human-centered, rather it's just being seen as something that needs to be efficient and the traffic needs to go faster. Well, here the traffic has stopped altogether. And this one is the Dîner en Blanc, which started obviously in France, but this picture is taken in Munich. We also have the Dîner en Blanc in Brisbane. It's a little bit less radical. I like the picture here in Munich because this is usually quite a busy intersection that the organizers have hijacked for this event, where people are all dressed in white, they come together, and they have an alfresco dining experience. So there's obviously a lot of merit in the human-centeredness, and this also extends to our work with regards to technology use and the design of new technology. This one is a picture taken at Federation Square. A couple of years ago, we worked with Fed Square on this idea of having people that are attending events at Fed Square be able to submit messages messages, text messages or tweets onto that quite iconic public screen. And we call this discussions in space, and that's been used at a number of occasions when the Queen visited Australia, when Cadel Evans won the Tour de France, and it's quite a robust system. Now, I'm though saying and making the argument here that the human-centeredness has a lot of merit, but it's also problematic because we are still not really thinking about other kinds of associated challenges such as urban sprawl, population growth, densification, and the impact it has on sustaining life on Earth. And I'll give you my pet example, pet pun intended, which is that in my spare time I'm a wombassador. I'm really very fond of wombats when I arrived here in Australia, and by now I've actually managed to find a way to integrate this into my academic work. We are doing a design project with a wombat sanctuary near Canberra in country New South Wales on designing new enclosures. If you want to find out more, there's a shortcut, bit.ly save our wombats, that explains a little bit more about this project. But the reason why I'm mentioning this is that wombats suffering from mange have a direct correlation to urbanization. The problem is that if you look at, for instance, this data that comes out of Western Sydney University that are mapping wombat populations, one of the interesting findings is that local wombat populations go extinct, and a lot of local wombat populations are extremely prone to the mange disease, which is a parasite that crawls under their skin, because of a lack of resilience. And researchers have now argued that this stems from the fact that their DNA is being weakened by infrastructure projects that are isolating them from other populations. So pretty much the different wombats can't interbreed. There's isolated pockets of wombats left in certain areas, but they can't reach their mates because a highway has been built or another settlement. And so as they're interbreeding with each other, the DNA becomes isolated, and eventually, once a parasite comes in, they succumb to that disease, and it's a very agonizing kind of situation. So when we are building for the human experience in so many cases, we are not necessarily considering the impact it has on the living environment. And sometimes this is very apparent, but in other cases it's not so apparent. Martin and I are quite active in the media architecture kinds of communities, and we've also been starting to critique and evaluate some of the light installations and the impact those have on nocturnal animals. The other problem that we see in the smart cities space is that we are arguing that the installations and the investment is about saving costs and being more productive and optimizing things, and often that is labeled under the banner of sustainability. But a lot of this is actually quite, it's consuming a lot of resources. In this case, for instance, the data I had here is that the total energy for running data centers that power the internet is now 3% of humanity's daily energy consumption, which sounds like a small figure, but this is actually quite huge if you consider all the different human activity that we are engaged in. This video was published by the Washington Post not too long ago, which shows workers in the Congo that are engaged in cobalt mining. It's unregulated. These guys are digging tunnels into the ground on their own. They're not organized or unionized. There's also not really a large corporation backing it. They're going to local wholesale traders in order to sell that cobalt. And that cobalt is probably in everyone's pocket, including my mobile phone and including my electric vehicle that I'm driving. So when we are talking about, for instance, putting solar on everyone's roof and everyone has to be driving an electric vehicle, what we're not considering is that our sustainability frame is often just focusing on either Australia or Queensland or Brisbane or our neighborhood. But there's actually somewhere where these kinds of flows start, and they also somewhere end. I got this little clip. I hope we have enough time for 1 minute to play this 1 minute snippet. What you're seeing here is some investigative journalism that Al Jazeera engaged in 2015 about
the biggest electronic waste dump site in Africa, I'd say. This is where electronic waste, television sets, computers, microwaves, refrigerators from most developed countries end up. Then you find kids, some as young as 5, 6, 7, 8, coming here to dismantle, to break open these electronic waste just to salvage metals such as copper. They sell these things to buy food, they use some of the money to buy food, and they give some money to their parents, and some would use part of the money to buy whatever they need to go to school.
Now, what I'm trying to illustrate is a need for us to rethink and maybe not wait 100 years, but maybe start already today, but it hopefully will have an impact over the next century, the way that we consider the human in the hierarchy of other living beings. And at the moment, we're at that pinnacle, and I'm suggesting that although human-centeredness and human-led innovation is a bit of a buzzword, and a lot of the different kinds of systems are catching up to that idea, I think we're actually now already at a moment where we got to question that yet again with regards to the discussion we had earlier this morning around the Anthropocene and the way we need to move post that. What is the post-anthropocentric kind of environment we would live in if we were to survive? This is a picture of my colleague Laura. Laura Falana works at the Institute of Design at the Illinois Institute of Technology in the US, and she published this article in Design Issues of MIT Press called Decentering the Human in the Design of Collaborative Cities. And it's one of those kind of key moments when I read this article that made me stop and think and question, in fact, the entire decade of work that we've been working towards. I'm not necessarily saying that we were wrong, but we actually now have a new agenda, a new kind of remit and a new impetus to be driving a bit of a different research strategy that goes into a new direction, and hopefully a broader one that repositions the human within an ecosystem of what Don has been calling multi-species entanglements. And there's a couple of these influences that I've been mapping for the OSCI conference that we had last year. So quite another influential work is David Abrams' notion of more than human worlds that has now been adopted by a number of scholars and commentators. I won't go through the entire list, but I'm happy to share the slides and the references if anyone is interested in this work. What's also quite nice is that it's now coming together. So it's not just limited to anthropology or the environmental humanities, but it's also being increasingly adopted in the design space and in other areas of academia. But the work still has to be done for this to be translated into policy and into specific leadership actions for that to be having an impact and for that to see industry engagement on the ground. But it's also great to see, for instance, Maria show us some real tangible proofs of concepts and prototypes and examples of how we can think of the way that humans can actually live in a much more peaceful and harmonious kind of relationship with the natural environment. The other examples that I wanted to add to that, to illustrate, is this, which I find interesting, but also in a way daunting. So the Ganges and the Jamuna rivers in India, and Tony might help me with the pronunciation there, the Wanganui River in New Zealand, have been given legal personhood. So they are considered to be legal persons. Now, that's already quite a breakthrough, but the question is, what does it mean? Is there now a committee that represents them when decisions are made? Where does the river end and where does it start? Is it just from source to the delta? Is it also the entire ecosystem? Does it include the fish? Does it include the fish only if it's in the river and not in the ocean anymore? So there's a whole bunch of questions, and also the criticism that emerged obviously quite immediately is that we're actually trying to do the opposite of what I've been describing earlier. We're actually taking a natural system, an ecosystem, and putting it back into a human way of governing and understanding it. So we're actually not changing our legal system, we're actually turning an ecosystem and putting it and abbreviating it perhaps into something that we can deal with. It's kind of like we're incorporating it. So there is the Ganges Incorporated. So it's much more akin to a company that is also a legal entity and, if you like, kind of similar to a legal person. So lots to think about how we actually go, not just in terms of engineering projects about this agenda of human entanglement and more than human futures, but also what does it look like in practice. And I'll leave you with these couple of images from my friend Natalie Jeremy-Janko, originally from Brisbane and now in New York. She's done a lot of work under that label of the environmental health clinic, and this is quite a beautiful example of creating a butterfly bridge. So this is the schematics of planting certain flowers that butterflies are attracted to at a higher altitude, so when they go from one side of the park to the other side of the park, that they are not hit by that school bus, for instance. And this is what it looks like in practice. If you're interested, the address down there, Environmental Health Clinic, gives you a whole bunch of videos and examples of other kinds of projects that Natalie has come up with. And just a teaser, we are later this month coming together in Belgium, in Hasselt, for the Participatory Design Conference, and we managed to get quite a nice array of submissions and papers of other people from across the world that are interested in this notion of more than human futures. This is a workshop organized by the colleagues that you can see there, Sarah Heitling, originally from Australia, but now working in Newcastle, Rachel Clark, Carl DiSalvo, Anne Light, and Laura Folano is part of it as well. And we just uploaded those papers. They're just short position papers that outline a whole bunch of different projects that people are already engaged in. So it's not just a theoretical kind of concept, it's now actually gaining some momentum and people are starting to actively research this area. So I hope that, as I said, we don't have to wait for the next 100 years to this to evolve, because I think there is a bit of an immediacy and a bit of an urgency to make this work scale if we want to avoid the urban ecocide. Thank you.